Hello, welcome back to World Regional Geography, Chapter 5. This time we're looking at Latin America, and it's referred to that oftentimes because whenever we look at Central and South America, we see a lot of regions that are speaking Latin languages. Spanish for Mexico, most of the Isthmus, portions of the Caribbean, and large portions of the western and southern portions of South America. Portuguese, of course, in Brazil, French in French Guiana, Dutch up in the north, a little bit in the Antilles. But that's the real reason, is because we have this predominance of Spanish, Portuguese, and to some extent French. As we look at the different countries in this region, we can start at the south with Argentina and Chile. Brazil. Between Brazil and Argentina, we have Uruguay, Paraguay as an interior country, Bolivia, and then heading over to the coast with Peru and Ecuador. Coming north, we have Colombia, Venezuela, Suriname, Guyana, and French Guiana. Coming up into the Isthmus, so into Central America, we have Panama, Costa Rica, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Belize, Mexico. So we're getting up to the North America border there. And then we have a series of islands to the Caribbean. We have the Greater Antilles, which are the Bahamas, which is next to Florida, Cuba, which is south of Florida. South of Cuba is Jamaica. East of those is the island of Hispaniola, which has Haiti on the western end and Dominican Republic on the eastern end, and Puerto Rico. And so those are the Greater Antilles. Of course, Puerto Rico is part of the U.S. And then you have the small chain of islands that comes down off of that, which is the Lesser Antilles. And there's so many there that we won't go into them. So those are the countries that you'll need to know for the map test for Chapter 5. There are two map tests, one that covers Central America and the Caribbean, and then one map test for South America. As we look at Central America and the Caribbean, we're looking at what's oftentimes referred to as the rimland. So those countries that are kind of disconnected because they are islands in the mainland. So those countries that are connected through the isthmus that connects North America and South America. As we look at the various issues in this region, physical geography is a significant one. So whenever we look at this area, we're looking at earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, all kinds of physical phenomena that impact this area that we'll talk about in just a second. First, we'll talk about hurricanes. Hurricanes, of course, are things that impact the Americas in terms of very dense low pressure systems. Now, these dense low pressure systems exist around the world in various summer times. Remember, there's different summer times between the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. But the ones that impact the Americas are called hurricanes. The ones that impact East Asia and Southeast Asia, and even Australia, are referred to as typhoons. And those that impact areas in the Indian Ocean are cyclones. So all the same thing in terms of what they are, very dense low pressure systems, but called different things depending on where they hit. Whenever we look at hurricanes and how we categorize them, we're talking about a system that starts at tropical depression and then a tropical storm where it gets named. Once it gets up to 74 miles per hour, we get into Category 1 hurricane. And those go up in increments until we get to Category 5, which is 155 miles per hour and above winds, consistent winds, constant winds near the eye. Those for us, as we talked about in eastern portions of North America, start a lot of times over Africa or in the Atlantic itself. And again, some of them do curve up and hit us in North America, but many also continue on hitting the Caribbean islands, hitting the isthmus as well throughout the area. So all this area is prone to impacts from these low pressure systems, these hurricanes. Whenever we look at other issues, we have the various plate boundaries. Remember, we're on the eastern side of the Ring of Fire. On the western side of Central America and South America, we're looking at plate boundaries. Now, they're actually intermediate plates, so they don't actually touch the Pacific plate. There's actually other plates between the Pacific plate and these continental plates. So you have the Coco plate that's a little bit further north, that's along the western side of Mexico and that area. As you come a little bit further south, you get into the Nazca plate, which is in the western side of South America. The Antarctic plate is further south as you get closer to Chile. There is a plate that actually runs through Mexico and into the Caribbean, and that's the Caribbean plate, and that's one where the volcanoes in Mexico City or near Mexico City are upwelling, as well as that's the plate boundary where the 2010 Haitian earthquake that of course devastated portions of Haiti. Now, all the mountains along this western coastline, they're tied to those convergent plate boundaries. So those mountains are still being created. The Andes, of course, very tall mountains, second tallest mountains after the Himalayas. Whenever you look at the highest elevations, we have different impacts here caused by the upwelling of cold currents on the western side of South America, and of course the diving warm currents on the eastern side of South America create different atmospheric effects and climate effects. So we generally have very little rainfall in southeastern portions of South America, southwestern portions and southeastern portions as well, because it's pretty cold down there. But especially southwestern, we have the Atacama Desert, in fact, in Chile, on the western side of the Andes Mountains, which is one of the driest places on Earth because of the cold waters that are coming up from Antarctica. And then we have the tropical rainforest of the Amazon being created by the warm, moist air that's coming off the Atlantic as the equatorial winds are blowing from the east to the west. This brings daytime rainfall, and again, we'll see this around the equator, around the world, so that we end up with significant rainforest at the equator. You have the Amazon in South America, the Congo rainforest and river valley in Africa, and we'll talk about the rainforest in Southeast Asia as well, but those don't lend themselves to massive river systems in the same way because it's largely islands in Southeast Asia. As we look at other impacts in this region, this is one of those where having a Pacific-centered map would be a lot better than Atlantic-centered map would be. We have El Nino, and El Nino is something that takes place in this the area of South Pacific, beginning kind of in the center and having impact in El Nino years on the eastern side of the Pacific Ocean and La Nina years on the western side of the Pacific Ocean. So it's one of those that kind of blurs the edge of a map. Globe would be much better here. So whenever we look at these areas in an El Nino year, this is when you get a slowing of the conveyor that brings up that cold water from the Antarctic Ocean along the west coast of South America. This allows warmer water to stick around and actually intrude a little bit from the west to the east, and that brings warm, moist air over the mountains of the Andes. Of course, once you have warm, moist air and mountains, you get that orographic lifting, which creates rainfall. And this is something that you don't see a lot of in this region, which impacts it fairly significantly. So you have landslides, flooding that happens every 2 to 7 years when El Nino occurs. That's not the norm in this area. As we look at La Nina then, where in an El Nino year, the warm waters drift a little bit further to the east than they normally do. La Nina, which usually follows or can follow El Nino, it overcorrects back further to the west. So where in an El Nino year, northern portions of Australia are dry, in a La Nina year, it's very wet. You get flooding in northern portions of Australia, and counterpoint, you get drier years than normal in western portions of South America. So it has an impact on both sides of the Pacific, but it also has impacts around the world. It's a global phenomena, even though it's something that happens in the southern Pacific. So whenever we have an El Nino, even places like eastern portions of Africa are impacted by these events by having a drier year generally. The 2015-2016 El Nino, we saw 80,000 people in Ethiopia go hungry. 22 million people in Eastern Africa in general were in danger of having food shortages. In places like Zimbabwe and further south in the east, you had 8,000 bovine, which some people rely on these for their own personal foodstuffs, basically expired in the early months of the El Nino back then. So it's something that isn't just related to Australia and South America. It's also a global impact. Even ourselves are impacted by it. And then finally, as we look at environmental impacts, don't forget that we're talking about mountains and an area that is pretty much desert on the western side of the mountains in the south in Chile. So populations that do live there rely on the glaciers that melt every summer. But with global warming, of course, we're getting fewer rainfalls and snowfall, leading to less ice pack melt in the mountain glaciers, which means that there's less runoff as melt occurs in the summers. This means that the people downstream, those that are closer to the coast, don't have access to fresh, clean water from those sources that they have had traditionally. And with growing populations, it's becoming an issue. We also have agricultural impacts in this region. As we look at this area, we're talking about an area where agriculture has been a dominant way of life for 7,000 years. Prehistoric populations, we had the introduction of maize in Central America and then spreading out into North and South America. Other products, such as gourds and turkey and such, are native to the Americas. And with those, whenever we get into the mountain areas, you have to find new ways to deal with the fact that as you go higher, temperatures go down. And so whenever you look at the altitudes in the mountains of the Americas, and this is used actually everywhere around the world, we have this idea of altitudinal zonation. So as you go up the mountain and get cooler and cooler temperatures and less rainfall, it's much like going further and further north or south from the equator. So if we look at the US, we have citrus that's being grown in the very far south, and then into things like beans, maize, gourds, eventually into the cooler regions where we grow things like onions and potatoes, which don't need the length of growing season that some other things do. And so the same thing as you see on the altitudinal zonation image here, you have at the bottom things like bananas and corn and fruits being grown at the lower elevations and eventually getting up to wheat and rye. And then finally those things like potatoes, and then moving into animals like cattle and llamas that can rely on just the grasses that can grow on the sides of the mountains before we get to the ice line or snow line. Now again, I mentioned that this is something that's gone on since the last 7,000 years that people have been here. And whenever we look at the contact period, there were state-level societies in the Americas, as we talked about in North America, but also in Central and South America. The Mayan population was still strong in Central America, though they were not to the same level of construction and complex society they were just a few hundred years earlier. So instead it was the Aztec around Mexico City and the Inca in the Andes that were the dominant state-level societies when Europeans came into this region. Now, it doesn't mean there weren't other smaller state-level societies and tons of smaller agrarian and even hunting and gathering societies throughout Central and South America. They were just kind of the two dominant ones that Europeans wrote about and talked about as they were moving into this region. As we look at what Europeans brought with them, of course, a lot of it had to do with trade goods. Everything from citrus, which of course plays a very significant role today in central portions or tropical portions of the Americas, things like grasses, not grasses in general, but a specific grass in terms of sugarcane. Of course, the other grass that was already native to the Americas, maize, made its way back towards Europe, Africa, and Asia. But there were a lot of things that came out of the Americas along with maize. You have various gourds, pumpkins and such. You have turkey. You have chocolate and vanilla, things that we oftentimes associate with European confectionaries are things that actually came out of the Americas. But perhaps one of the most impactful things that Europeans brought with them were domesticated animals. And these are animals that Europeans and Africans and Asians had been around for millennia and had built up antibodies to diseases that we shared with those animals or that we got from those animals. So whenever they brought the animals over and they brought themselves over, the disease such as flu and measles, these type of things that Europeans and Asians and Africans had antibodies to, these are diseases that swept through the Americas. And we saw somewhere between 75 and 90% of the population in the Americas die because of disease. Again, numbers did die because of direct conflict, but direct conflict actually became very easy for Europeans because so many people had already died before the Europeans even got to where the people were. So this is one of the many legacies of the Columbian Exchange. Whenever we look at this area, we also have to be aware of not just the impact that Europeans had on native populations, but the impacts that Europeans had on African populations in the Americas. So whenever we look at the Atlantic Slave Triangle, or as some books will call it, the Atlantic Trade Triangle, we're talking about trade goods coming from Europe, coming down to Africa, being traded with slavers of Arabic, European, and even African descent. Those Europeans then taking the slaves they had bought across to the Americas. Now, as you'll see with the Brazil video, many of these actually ended up in Brazil, just going straight across the equator. But others did end up in the Caribbean, in North America, of course. And we're talking about somewhere around 10 million people, I believe, between 1600 and the late 1800s being forcibly moved from Africa into the Americas. Today, of course, that means that you have countries like Brazil, who has a population that is almost 50% or even more than 50% either native or African descendant. And that doesn't even go into some of the issues of Asian populations that moved into the region as well. So people of color are dominant in many areas, and in some countries, especially in South America, you do still have countries where native populations, their language is the dominant language. So for instance, in Paraguay, there are native populations that their language is the dominant language of the country, where native populations are the dominant force in political action. So we do still see some areas where European influence isn't total, but it's really in the end, it's much like North America, where you do have a very strong influence from European historical aspects, at least, if not European descendants themselves. Now, this region, just like all others, we see the move from rural areas to urban areas be very significant. We see 2 of the world's top 15 population centers in this region. Whenever we begin to look at the favelas, one of the big things is that they stand out as an area of inequality in these cities. So whereas in North America, we see kind of a veneer of equality in places like New York City or places like San Francisco, LA, Chicago. Again, it's really a veneer that hides the inequalities, whereas whenever you look at places in Central and South America, whenever you look at places really in the global South in general, it's easier to be able to see the levels of inequality that exist between those people who have access to economic opportunities and those who don't. So yeah, definitely watch the videos about the favelas and those people who are coming out of the favelas and getting opportunities to go to university, to get jobs in the arts and those type of things that the video highlights. That's it for Chapter 5. Remember, Chapter 4 and 5 is your next test. So after you finish the materials for Chapter 5, you'll have exam number 3 that will cover Chapters 4 and 5, North America, Central and South America. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a good day.